Since 1971, Nigeria has pumped over $1.3 trillion of crude oil out of the ground. 225 million people live there. 133 million of them are in poverty. That's not a poverty rate that we see, that's a population bigger than Japan, bigger than Germany, roughly equal to the United Kingdom and France combined. Nigeria has been pumping oil at OPEC scale for 53 years. Its citizens, on average, have ended up with less. That's not just a story about Nigeria. Economists have a name for the pattern. The Nobel Prize was awarded for explaining it last year. To understand how a country pumps $1 trillion of oil and ends up poor, start with what economists actually measured. In 1995, two Harvard economists, Jeffrey Sachs and Andrew Warner, ran a regression across 95 developing countries. The question: do natural resources help or hurt economic growth? The result was the opposite of what most people would have predicted. A 1 percentage point increase in resource exports as a share of GDP was associated with approximately 0.07 percentage points lower annual GDP growth. That sounds small. Compounded over 50 years on a developing country growing at 3 to 4%, it produces a gap of 30 to 50% in cumulative wealth. Resource-rich countries grew slower than resource-poor ones, on average, across decades, holding everything else equal. The finding has been replicated dozens of times. It is a settled empirical regularity in development economics. The phenomenon needed a name. 2 years earlier, in 1993, British geographer Richard Auty, AWT, had given it one in a book titled Sustaining Development in Mineral Economies. He called it the resource curse. On paper, having natural resources should be an unambiguous good. 5 clean arguments line up behind it. The wealth creation argument. Oil, gas, diamonds, cobalt, all of these are valuable. Selling them produces revenue. Revenue funds development. The mechanism is simple and intuitive. The infrastructure argument. Resource extraction requires roads, ports, refineries, schools to train workers. The build-out spills over to the rest of the economy. Norway's oil paid for tunnels and bridges. Saudi Arabia's oil paid for Riyadh. The export earnings argument. Hard currency from resource sales pays for imports of capital goods. Without exports, a developing country can't buy the machinery it needs to industrialize. Resources solve a critical bottleneck. The diversification head start argument. A poor country with no resources has nothing to start with. A resource-rich poor country has at least one industry. Diversifying out of one industry is easier than building from zero. The lottery argument. It's better to have natural endowment than not to. Botswana built one of Africa's strongest economies on top of diamonds. Norway built a sovereign wealth fund worth $1.7 trillion on top of North Sea oil. The resources can work. 5 arguments, none of them wrong on paper, but in the empirical record, Sachs and Warner's data, they don't on average win. Something inside the mechanism actively works against the simple wealth flows from resources story. This episode isn't an indictment of resource-rich countries or of mining or of oil. It's a structural observation about a specific gap, the gap between the popular intuition that resources mean wealth and the documented historical record that, more often than not, resources correlate with the opposite. Picture 4 cases, same century, different continents, different commodities, same outcome. Case A, Nigeria, already in the hook. $1.3 trillion of oil since 1971. Africa's largest economy, OPEC member, 225 million people, 63% of them, 133 million, in multidimensional poverty. Life expectancy, 53 years, GDP per capita, roughly $1,650. The non-oil economy is finally growing faster than oil in 2024, a partial reversal, but 5 decades of structural damage are not undone in 2 years. Case B, The Democratic Republic of Congo, the country sits on roughly 70% of the world's cobalt, the metal in every iPhone battery, every Tesla battery, every laptop battery on Earth, plus copper, plus diamonds, plus gold, plus coltan, plus lithium. GDP per capita, about $650, among the 5 poorest countries on Earth. Human Development Index ranking, 180th out of 193. An estimated 40,000 children work in artisanal cobalt mines under hazardous conditions, documented by Amnesty International. The country's wealth doesn't reach the country's people. It funded a 5 million death civil war from 1996 to 2003. Today it funds a small political and military elite, while the median citizen earns less per year than the price of one iPhone whose battery contains the country's cobalt. Case C, Venezuela, the country with the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, 303 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia. In 2013, the GDP per capita was about $10,000. Today, it is approximately $3,800, a 62% collapse in 11 years. 7.5 million Venezuelans have left the country, the largest displacement in Latin American history. Hyperinflation between 2016 and 2019, covered in the previous episode of this series. Case D, the counterfactuals, Switzerland. Population 8.8 million, no oil, no minerals, no agricultural surplus, alpine terrain, GDP per capita, $105,000, among the highest in the world. Singapore, population 5.9 million, zero natural resources, imports water. GDP per capita, $92,000, cost top 5 globally. Japan, population 124 million, imports over 90% of its energy. GDP per capita, $33,000, world's 4th largest economy. These 3 countries have nothing in the ground. They have between them the highest GDP per capita averages on the planet, 20 to 65 times higher than Nigeria's, 140 times higher than Congo's. The variable that explains the gap is not what's under the soil, it's what's above it. Most people picture poverty as a story about geography, climate, or history. Sometimes those matter. Underneath them, 3 structural insights, 3 different decades. Name what is actually happening. Mechanism 1. In 1993, the same Richard Auty published Sustaining Development in Mineral Economies and coined the term that organizes the entire field: the resource curse. Auty's thesis: mineral wealth, far from being a development catalyst, frequently produces currency overvaluation, manufacturing sector contraction, public spending volatility, and rent-seeking political competition. The country becomes worse off, not better, despite the obvious wealth. The thesis was contested when first published. 2 years later, the empirical record arrived. Mechanism 2. Jeffrey Sachs and Andrew Warner at Harvard ran the regression in 1995 and published it as an NBER working paper, Natural Resource Abundance and Economic Growth. Across 95 developing countries from 1970 to 1989, the more resource export dependent the economy, the slower the growth. The penalty was not catastrophic per year, about 0.07 percentage points of growth per percentage point of resource share, compounded over half a century, a 30 to 50% cumulative wealth gap. Auty's thesis was no longer contested. The curse was real, but the question of why remained. Mechanism 3. In 2012, Turkish-American MIT economist Daron Acemoglu, Gemolu, and political scientist James Robinson published Why Nations Fail: The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty. Their answer: it isn't really about resources, it's about institutions. Nations fail because of extractive institutions. They succeed because of inclusive ones. Inclusive institutions distribute power broadly. They protect property rights. They enforce rule of law. They reward productive effort. Switzerland, Singapore, post-Meiji Japan, post-1688 England, post-1789 United States, all examples. Extractive institutions concentrate power and wealth in a small elite. They fail to enforce property rights for ordinary people. They reward political connection rather than productive effort. Colonial Latin America, much of post-colonial Africa, mineral state petrostates, all examples. In the Acemoglu and Robinson framework, oil and minerals are not the cause of underdevelopment. They are the vector through which extractive institutions persist, because mineral revenue allows political elites to fund themselves without taxing and therefore without being accountable to their citizens. In October 2024, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics jointly to Acemoglu, Robinson, and MIT economist Simon Johnson for studies of how institutions are formed and affect prosperity. 3 mechanisms, 3 different decades, 1 repeating pattern. Auty named it. Sachs and Warner proved it. Acemoglu, Robinson, and Johnson explained it, and last year won the Nobel Prize for it. Once you see the mechanism, the rest of the story is what it does. You into one life, one economy, and one political system at the level of one life. Imagine a Nigerian small-scale farmer or trader earning the median income, roughly $1,800 a year. The American at the same percentile in their country earns about $60,000. The Nigerian earns approximately 3% of what the American does for similar effort. Life expectancy: 53 years in Nigeria, 78 in the United States. Maternal mortality: 1,047 deaths per 100,000 births in Nigeria, 22 in the United States. Years of schooling expected: 11 in Nigeria, 16 in the United States. Internet penetration: 41% in Nigeria, 92 in the United States. 60% of Nigerian households have unreliable grid power. 40% have no electricity. The single citizen has done nothing wrong. The country has produced trillions of dollars of oil. The institutional architecture is what determines whether that productivity reaches her at the level of one country. Sachs-Warner's 0.07 percentage point annual growth penalty, compounded over 50 years on a developing country growing at 3 to 4%, produces a gap of 30 to 50% in cumulative GDP between an otherwise similar resource-rich country and a resource-poor one. For Nigeria specifically, had the country grown at the rate of resource-poor East Asian economies, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, since 1970, current GDP per capita would be roughly $15,000 to $25,000 rather than $1,600, a tenfold gap attributable to the institutional consequences of oil dependence. At the level of the political system, the curse correlates with lower democracy scores, longer authoritarian tenures, and higher likelihood of civil conflict. The Acemoglu and Robinson framework identifies a feedback loop. Extractive economic institutions reinforce authoritarian political institutions, and vice versa. The Nobel Committee specifically cited this feedback loop in the 2024 prize announcement. 3 layers of damage. Same logic. The wealth is there, the institutional architecture decides who gets it. This episode is sponsored by my own private community. If thinking about institutions instead of resources made you want practical tools to read them, this is built for it. A toolkit where I work through over 100,000 breakdowns: how to read corruption indices, how rule of law scores predict 10-year returns, how sovereign wealth fund discipline actually works in practice. Not theory. Tools you can apply to any country, any market. Link is in the description below. All right, back to the diagnosis. Once you see the mechanism in full, natural resources stops being a useful predictor of national wealth. The predictor that actually works is the quality of institutions. The United States has substantial natural resources, but became wealthy primarily through inclusive institutions, Constitution, Bill of Rights, common law tradition, public education, federalism. It has remained wealthy through institutional resilience even as its resource industries have shrunk relative to services. Norway has oil and is rich. Botswana has diamonds and is one of Africa's strongest economies. Both built sovereign wealth funds, institutional firewalls, and rule of law before resource extraction got out of hand. Nigeria, Congo, Venezuela have oil, cobalt, and and remain poor. The institutional architecture got hijacked by the resource industry rather than disciplining it. Switzerland, Singapore, and Japan have nothing in the ground at all and are among the wealthiest places on Earth. For an individual participant, this means three things. There is no exit from the institutional system you live inside. Property rights, court enforcement, contract reliability, bureaucratic competence. These are the things that determine whether your life's work compounds or evaporates. There is no immune economy. The US dollar's institutional buffer is real and strong, but it is a function of institutions, not endowment. Institutions can erode. The 2024 Nobel was awarded for proving this matters. There is no exemption for individual citizens of resource-cursed countries. The path out is institutional reform. Slow, contested, costly. Botswana shows it is possible. Most resource-cursed countries take 50 to 100 years. The wealth was never under the soil. It was always in the laws, the courts, and the trust between strangers. 3 operational rules to take from this. Rule 1. Read institutions, not endowments. When you evaluate a country for investment, for immigration, for understanding any economic news, start with the institutional indicators. World Bank, Worldwide Governance Indicators, Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, Polity for Democracy scores. These are public, free, and updated annually. They predict outcomes better than any commodity reserves chart. Rule 2, the resource is a vector, not a destiny. Resource-rich countries with strong institutions, Norway, Botswana, Australia, Canada, Chile to a degree, convert resource wealth into broad prosperity. Resource-rich countries with weak institutions, Nigeria, Venezuela, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, see the resource hollow out the institutions further. The same oil produces opposite outcomes depending on the institutional architecture it lands in. Rule 3, institutions can change slowly. Singapore in 1965 was poorer than the Democratic Republic of Congo on some metrics. Switzerland in 1850 was a poor agricultural economy. Japan in 1860 was a closed feudal society. Institutional change is possible over decades with consistent leadership, with luck, with some external pressure. Botswana is the most dramatic recent example. Most countries, however, take 50 to 100 years to make the transition. Institutional reform is the longest duration investment a society can make. These are operational rules, not philosophical ones. They don't fix the system. They give you a way to read it accurately and place yourself, your work, and your capital inside the right part of it. Since 1971, Nigeria has pumped over $1.3 trillion of crude oil out of the ground. 133 million Nigerians remain in poverty. 8 billion people now wake up every morning inside an economic system whose national wealth outcomes are determined less by what's in the ground and more by what's in the laws. Auty named the curse in 1993. Sachs and Warner proved it empirically in 1995. Acemoglu, Robinson and Johnson explained it through institutional theory in 2012 and won the Nobel Prize for it in 2024. The mechanism is well documented. The Nobel was awarded last year. The work is hiding in plain sight. If you want more breakdowns like this, subscribe. There's a lot of math worth understanding. Numbers don't lie, but they don't explain themselves either.